to GFTU, who is our partner for this year and next year for this series. Today's discussion is a very timely and important one. The session is titled Imperialism, Economics of Re-armament and Militarism. And just like the session from 2 weeks ago, this is going to be a panel discussion between Professor Costas Lapavitsas and Professor Clara Mattei. We are in a very crucial moment. The rules-based order is collapsing. That is the euphemism for American hegemony wrapped in multilateral institutions. It's no longer holding. We're witnessing the emergence of a new form of imperialism as hegemonic powers lose their grip and scramble to maintain dominance through an increasingly desperate measures. And globalization, the promise to integrate for integration and prosperity, fragments into spheres of influence. Trade wars are replacing agreements, industrial policy returns while neoliberal orthodoxy fractures, supply chains are weaponized, currencies are sanctioned, and economic blocs are hardened along geopolitical lines. And what is the result? A return to extreme state violence. Global military spending is breaking historical records. NATO expands eastwards. War returns to Europe. And the Indo-Pacific is militarizing. And all of this while we are witnessing a symptom, an important one, which is the burning of the Palestinian people while we all watch. This is what a capitalist crisis looks like, when profits can no longer be secured through markets alone. They are pursued through missiles. All this while workers face soaring prices, stagnant wages, and extremely difficult living conditions in general. In today's discussion, we will examine broadly 3 connected questions. We will talk about how does contemporary militarism relate to capitalist accumulation and imperial competition. We will also ask what derives this unprecedented global rearmament. And we will ask what are the economic consequences of choosing violence over other approaches. So our panelists bring complementary perspectives to these urgent questions. Professor Costas Lapavitsas examines imperialism as a system, analyzing how military-industrial complexes, particularly America's, shape global hierarchies and drive geopolitical tension from NATO expansion to great power rivalry. Professor Mattei argues that from Gaza to austerity Europe, military spending isn't a deviation from normal economics, but rather the violent foundation that sustains the economic order. And obviously the 2 of them will add and correct if I misspoke on their behalf. So before we go ahead, just brief introductions, even though they don't need an introduction as they are both part of the organizing committee of this lecture series, which is now running for the 3rd year. Professor Costas Lapavitsas is Professor of Economics at SOAS University of London. His work centers on monetary theory and the political economy of money, and his most recent book, published by Verso in 2023, is The State of Capitalism, Economy, Society, and Hegemony. His publications are beyond my ability to list, but they are many. And Professor Clara Mattei is professor in Tulsa University. She is the president of the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, the FREE, and recently her first book was published in 2022 by University of Chicago, The Capital Order, How Economists Invent Austerity and Pave the Way for Fascism. And without further ado, I would like to open it up for Professor Lapavitsas. He will speak for around 15 minutes. Then Professor Mattei will come in and also speak for another 15 minutes. And then we will have a 30-minute discussion between the 3 of us. And then at the 1-hour mark, we will open up the questions and answers by the audience. I would ask everyone to please post their questions in the Q&A box and not in the regular chat box, because I will only be looking at questions that are coming in through the Q&A box. Okay, and with that, Costas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hanin. It's a pleasure to speak on this second event of this series. And it's a pleasure to speak on this issue, I would have said, if it wasn't so bloody and so horrible to analyze. But anyway, the world is what it is, and we've got to confront it directly, and we've got to try and understand why it presents us with these phenomena, awful as they might be. Now, there is, as you said, Hanin, in the introduction, no doubt at all that we live in an era of intensification of imperialist conflict, hegemonic contestation, and of course, war. Three sides dominate this. Ukraine, obviously, a war that's been going on for 4 years. Palestine and Gaza, in particular, which has been going on for 2 years with utter devastation. And obviously, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and what that means. But there are many more areas in which we can see this intensification of conflict, contestation, imperialism appearing in a variety of aggressive and new forms. And this is really what we need to understand. Now, from a Marxist political economy perspective, this means going to the economic roots of imperialism. And I say this with some conviction because imperialism, you see, can be criticized, refuted, damned by from a variety of standpoints, and it has been. You can have a moral critique of imperialism. You can have a political critique of imperialism. You can have all kinds, a religious critique of imperialism, and there've been plenty over the years. None of these has survived over the years because they haven't got roots, really. The ones that have survived are the ones connected to the economic foundations of imperialism, and the dominant one is Marxism here. The Marxist analysis of imperialism has sustained itself. But we need to see how it fits and what form it should take for the current period, because obviously conditions change. The way in which big business and capital interacts across the world changes, and we've got to be aware of the new forms of imperialism. And this is what I want to do today. I want to give you a flavor of that, drawing on the book that you mentioned just a minute ago, Hanin, The State of Capitalism book, where we developed this argument. Now, let me start with a few numbers just to make sure that people really understand what we're talking about. If you look at military expenditure, which is the wherewithal of military arms contestation, you need to be spending a large part of your income in order to be able to have military presence across the world. Then you will see that the champion is the United States, without question. It spends about $1 trillion a year officially on military matters. It probably spends more, but officially about $1 trillion. China comes second with about 300 billion. It's about a third of what the United States spends. Then comes Russia with 140 billion. And then the European powers, Britain, France, Germany, the big one now, with about 90 billion, 85 billion each. Incidentally, if you add up the European powers, you're going to get considerably more military spending, even with these three, Britain, France, and Germany, than Russia spends. The notion that Europe doesn't spend money on arms, and therefore it needs to spend more in order to match Russia, doesn't fit with the numbers. It already spends much more than Russia does, if you add up all the countries of Europe, but we'll consider that as we move along. So these are the big spenders for arms expenditure. There are others, but these are the big ones. If you look at what they've done over the last 4 to 5 years, since 2020 really, you will see that the United States has increased its expenditure by nearly 30%. Russia has increased it by 140% because it's war. It's a war economy now. But Europe has also increased its expenditure dramatically. Germany by almost 70%. Britain by 35%. China, about which so much noise is made, is actually the last one in this list. It has increased its expenditure, but not as much as the others. And that's important to bear in mind because there's a lot of talk about China. Be that as it may, there is no question that military expenditure has increased dramatically over the last 5 years, with the United States by a long mile at the top. The United States, incidentally, spends a lot of this money on nuclear weapons. It is modernizing its nuclear weaponry. It is spending and planning to spend about $100 billion a year on that. It's also spending a lot of money on missiles, ships, and so on. China is also spending a lot of money on ships, Russia on everything, because Russia is, as I said before, an arms economy now. It's a war economy. So we're talking serious money, and I'm not going to give you any more numbers in terms of percentages of GDP and so on, because I think I've said enough. It's a significant amount of money in the current conditions. Now, is there any prospect that this might be declining? Because a lot of people think that if somehow we cut a deal, the expenditure will subside and we might go back to some kind of more reasonable arrangement. For the forthcoming 5 years, there's no prospect at all. These expenditures are locked in. They're locked in by law. They're locked in by contract often. They're locked in terms of political decisions. So basically, you're looking at a situation in which military expenditure, and therefore everything that follows in terms of contestation, armed contestation, will get worse and worse. Will be as tense as it is now, and it will get tenser ahead. And military capacity, the production of arms and weaponry, will become even bigger ahead. Let me give you some figures now about what this means for the United States. A lot of the people who take part in this series are from the United States, rightly so. The United States is the main arms spender in the world. What does it mean? What does it mean for the United States to spend $1 trillion a year? What does it mean for US capitalism to spend $1 trillion a year? As you know, and he has been many times mentioned and referred to, starting with President Eisenhower a long time ago, the US capitalism has at its core a military-industrial complex. He used that term a long time ago, and he has stayed. And that's pivotal for US capitalism. In other words, it's a permanent arms production and a permanent military presence, such as we've never known in history in terms of its size. So the United States spends roughly $1 trillion a year. That's currently. Of that, the Pentagon has got $850 billion available to it to spend annually. That's what it spent last year, $850 billion. Half of that, $430 billion, is spent through contract obligations. It goes to businesses. I'll come back to that in a minute. The other half goes to the salaries and payments and so on of military personnel, which circles the globe. The United States has got hundreds of military bases. They're very expensive. It's got personnel everywhere. It's got to be paid. Half of the expenditure of the Pentagon annually goes to that. The other half goes to business. Which business? There are 200,000 enterprises which are on contract with the Pentagon. Big, small, medium-sized, a lot across the United States, which obviously have got an interest in the maintenance of arms expenditure by the Pentagon and the maintenance of arms production of different types. That, in a sense, is also a kind of social foundation for militarism and for arms expenditure, which affects the working class in the US. And those of you in the United States who wish to intervene in this debate should be clear about it. We're talking $430 billion a year, as I said, and 200,000 enterprises attached to it. But of course, among the 200,000 enterprises, there are just five, which are the big fish. So we're talking Lockheed Martin, we're talking Raytheon, we're talking Northrop, we're talking Boeing Defense, we're talking General Dynamics. These five, among them, control 40% of the contracts. That's the military-industrial complex at its heart. These five big businesses, which are actually present across the world in many ways, which control the bulk of military production in the United States, absorb a large part of Pentagon expenditure, and also export arms across the world. If you add the arms exports that these enterprises engage in, you're talking $400 billion controlled by them. It's big business. That's the military-industrial complex at its heart, together with large numbers of other smaller enterprises. That begins to give you a sense of the capitalist interests involved in this. Imperialism, contestation, arms expenditure and arms conflict has to do with capital and its interests at bottom. And in the United States, it is in its most obvious when you look at the military-industrial complex. But it's more than that. When you look at the other players, the hegemonic contestants that have emerged, China is the big one, Russia is the next one. These three powers are the present superpowers. These are the superpowers currently present, but also the Europeans bringing up the rear. You will see that the contestation they're engaging in globally, supported by arms, is driven by economics in very concrete ways. The interests involved in rearming yourself and opposing others might be presented in ideological terms. Apparently, they've all discovered that Putin is a dictator, that the Chinese are run by dictators, that the Palestinians, I don't know what they are, Iran is run by dictators, and so on. All that's ideological claptrap, basically. The contestation among these powers is driven by economics, and here the economics is very, very clear and very concrete. The contestation is about assets, and here we're talking supply chains, we're talking control of sea lanes, we're talking control of data cables, we're talking control of overseas assets, we're also talking control of resources, LNG, rare earths, chips, we're talking control over critical minerals, but we're also talking control over military R&D, which fits tightly with, of course, technological developments, particularly when it comes to things like AI or hypersonics and so on. All that has got a military dimension. We're also talking about industrial policy of sorts, because if you want to contest, you need industry that will do that, and you need to develop capacity to do it. Finally, we're talking contestation about financial issues. Who controls the payments mechanisms? Who controls SWIFT? Who controls the ability to pay? Who controls the US dollar and other contestants that might threaten it? That begins to give you a sense of the economic powers behind this. If you look at the field of contestation, such as what I've just mentioned, that gives you a sense of who are the economic powers which are behind this and actually are leading the militarization in the imperialist conflict. And there, the answer is very clear. We've developed it in that book that Hanin mentioned in State of Capitalism, but I will sum it up for you here. Two forces are at play here. At the root of it, that's what drives imperialism today and militarism. First, multinational corporations. Multinational corporations, global chain controllers of oil, of bulk shipping, of critical minerals, of semiconductors, of agribusiness, of big pharma, but also big finance players. Those who control the payments networks, the banks, the big asset managers. These are the capitals which are involved, and they are directly implicated in the contested fields that I mentioned before. Imperialism has to do with their interests, defending their interests, defending how they can make profits, to which purpose they mobilize their nation states, of course, and they rely on other states in order to do it and generate the tendency towards militarism and eventually towards war. War comes out of the competition of these big businesses, and that is a lesson that Marxist political economy has taught us many, many times before, and it is as true now as it was 100 years ago, except it's taken this particular form today. Now, I've spoken for some time, and I'm sure Hanin will pull me off in a minute for being very near my deadline. I just want to draw one more point here, mention one more point here, which is important. A lot of people who are interested in Marxist political economy, rightly so, because the world is the mess that it is and it needs a change, refer back to the classical theories of imperialism. And they are right to do it. So that's, in a sense, what I've done. However, I was at pains to point out these classical theories of imperialism and militarism and the threat of war, useful as they are, they do not apply directly today. Imperialism is certainly present, but classical imperialism is not present. What is present is contemporary imperialism, and I've drawn the outlines of it, and I hope to condense it in a minute for you now. Classical imperialism was again driven by economic interest, but what those big interests attempted at that time was to create colonies, territorial control, jurisdictional control over land. Contemporary imperialism, the big businesses, the big banks don't need that. They don't need colonies. They can control through choke points. They can control through extraterritorial law. They can control through a variety of treaties. That's how imperialism works by big business today. Classical imperialism needed gunboats, customs control, and so on. Contemporary imperialism serves its interest through payments control, technology control, logistics control, and so on. And if it comes to it, it uses, of course, military force as well. Classical imperialism also depended on colonial rent, direct extraction of value from people who had been colonized. Contemporary imperialism doesn't do that, but it does draw surpluses, and it does draw surpluses indirectly through IP, through the use of platforms, in a whole variety of other ways. Classical imperialism also needed an imperial administration. Contemporary imperialism doesn't need an imperial administration. It often has the multilaterals, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, that do the job for them. But it remains imperialism. It remains aggressive. It is driven by these two fundamental forms of capital. And if you look at these two forms of capital, the big multinationals controlling trade and production, the big finance enterprises controlling assets and so on, financial assets and so on, you will recognize that this pairing of capitals is the most aggressive form of capital in history. There is no question about it. It's a form of capital that wants to devour the world. It brooks no opposition. It's incredibly aggressive, and it mobilizes the nation state behind it. And that is what is driving us to war. If you really want to do something about stopping the drive to war, then militarism and so on, you've got to start at home. You've got to start with social transformation at home. You've got to start with a fight against capitalism at home. And you've got always to bear in mind that imperialism oppresses and subverts and dominates people abroad, and you've got to defend their right to defend themselves. And in this way, we might begin to see some progress again. That's what I had to say. I look forward to what Carla will say now, and then we can have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Costas, for this very, very insightful lecture. Now we will go to Clara. Please, Clara,
thank
go
you.
ahead.
Yes, thank you, Costas, for the wonderful introduction. I would like to start my discussion with focusing on the laboratory of the frontier of advanced capitalist dynamics, and especially militarist and imperial dynamics, which is Gaza today. As we know, in the past 48 hours, over 100 civilians were killed, one third of whom were actually children. We know that 90% of all buildings in Gaza have been completely erased to the ground. And already in April 2024, over 70,000 tons of explosives had been used in Gaza, which were already 4.5 times more than the atomic bomb that annihilated Hiroshima in August 1945. We know that it is now the zone where most journalists have been killed in any war on record, and the deadliest for medical personnel in recent history. we know in this sense that there is somewhat of a singularity of the Israeli campaign in Gaza right now, just out of the sheer asymmetry of power. And this is important because the West is involved in many conflicts, and Costas gave the staggering numbers, and in various ways, from raw materials to ally support of weapons and other implications. But in Gaza, what we see is that, as Adam Tooze actually put it, it's the intensity, its enclosure, its direct connection to settler colonial project that leads us to actually understand how incredibly advanced this violent imperial nature of the West against a population in the global South has become, right? And it's actually, Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide of 1940 in the 1940s, which is actually modeled on the Nazi-occupied Poland, that is, of course, the most important to understand what's happening here, also in terms of the starvation campaign. So we need to figure out how we've gotten this far, and how we've gotten this far in how, of course, the West is not only silent with respect to what it's doing, and I think it's really important to notice this incredible disconnect between civil society that is mobilizing and, of course, mainstream media and the representatives of government in this moment. But it's also really fundamental to focus on the web, the interconnected web of beneficiaries from this context. So I think what Costas has been saying, in a way, is highlighted from the specificities of Gaza. From October 2023 to July 2025, the stock price of two aerospace and defense giants like RTX Corporation and Leonardo. Leonardo is the biggest Italian war company, soared by 77% and 234% respectively. And we know that what Francesca Albanese has done, that was really what got her in severe trouble. Francesca Albanese is the special rapporteur on occupied territories, is that she released a report in June 2025 in which she really showed the whole ecosystem, the network of enabler that sustained the arms industry's windfall, right? So it was not just the arms industry, it was law firms, auditing and consulting firms, arms dealers, universities, brokers. So she's unveiling really the whole web of corporations that are involved, including tech giants like Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, and financial powerhouses like Vanguard, BlackRock, and the world's largest extractive energy conglomerates. So it is this that is fascinating and terrifying about Gaza, is that the whole world, the whole capitalist world, is implicated in the ongoing recent genocide. So the question here is, how can we advance in our understanding of capitalism from these atrocities that are making it very hard to stay sane in this historical moment? And this is where the Marxian tradition that Costas is also an exponent of really helps, because it's really about understanding war not just as an issue of geopolitical conflicts, but as fundamental a fundamental economic structure. And it's here that, in fact, we see how someone like Rosa Luxemburg was a pioneer in understanding the fundamental intrinsic relation between capitalism and militarism. And I would like to actually read you a couple of her quotes, because I think they are incredibly timely in how she was Rosa Luxemburg, for those who don't know, she was a Jewish Polish scholar who was active in Berlin and, of course, died in Berlin in the insurrection of the Spartacist movement. And she has the most comprehensive and theoretically sophisticated analysis of the connection between capitalism, imperialism, and militarism, showing us how it is in fact integral to how capitalism expands and sustains itself, right? So this is really important. And this is a couple of her quotes. She says, militarism fulfills a quite definite function in the history of capital, accompanying as it does every historical phase of accumulation. And again, she writes, while it is true that capitalism lives from non-capitalist formations, it is more precise to say that it lives from their ruin. In other words, while this non-capitalist milieu is indispensable for capitalist accumulation, providing its fertile soil, accumulation in fact proceeds at the expense of this milieu and is constantly devouring it. It is only the constant progressive erosion of these non-capitalist formations that the very conditions of the existence of capital accumulation are given. So what was Rosa Luxemburg telling us, one of the pioneers in the Marxian tradition of the understanding of the deep connection between capitalism, militarism, and imperialism, was exactly the idea that capital accumulation, to sustain itself, required the devouring and the encompassing of non-capitalist dimensions and societies, right? And so, of course, this is definitely the case in the early forms of capitalism, what was Costas was calling classic imperialism, but clearly it's something that continues today. The fact that given how anarchic the capitalist economy is, in the sense that there is, in fact, competition amongst capitalists to be able to sell the services and the goods they produce. The best way to have this happen is by a fundamental support of the capitalist state that offers new outlets, new spaces, new markets, and new raw material in order to, in fact, be able to support this constant maximization of profits. So it's really important here to understand how militarism and capitalism only makes sense if we focus on the fundamental role of the state, and this is something that Costas mentions, of the state in fact, supporting capital accumulation and this requirement of dealing with what Rosa Luxemburg understood as a problem of effective demand. If you keep pressuring wages downward in order to maintain the surplus high, then what happens is that you need to find outlets for your products that will not be internally taken care of and consumed by the working classes. And of course, war, permanent expansion and annihilation of and englobation of other social formations is more than ever crucial. So this is, I think, a very important intuition of how the capitalist state is trying to do the general interest of capital accumulation by supporting, by stepping into these limits and contradiction that the system produces itself. And this is really important because it's actually something that even Keynesian economists understood. And this is where I would like to actually make the leap from Rosa Luxemburg, that understood how effective demand was a problem in the anarchist capitalist system, and how thus you needed the states to actually promote capital accumulation through militarism and imperialism. Then we see here how there is a conversation about effective demand that is the key conversation that also Keynesian economists are having from the 30s and especially after the Second World War. And what you note, and this is really important, is that in the understanding of the Keynesian economists themselves, such as something like James Tobin, who was an important economist advising the Kennedy administration in the 1960s, they understood clearly that militarism was the key to boost economic growth also after the Second World War. So it's fascinating to note how these authors, and James Tobin himself said, there is a big idealization of the New Deal as a space where, in fact, the state had boosted capital accumulation and resolved the Great Depression through supposed public public works and social services. What these Keynesians are saying themselves is that what's happening here is a great idealization, because actually what boosted the economy was, of course, the Second World War, and then the Korean War, and then the Vietnam War. And that is this permanent warfare rather than welfare that maintained US hegemony and, in general, global capitalist accumulation in an active measure capable of fighting against the so-called communist bloc. And this is, I think, really important, because it leads to the question of what are the political conditions that foster militarism as such a central feature of the capitalist economy. And I think what you find out is that, in fact, the part of the political conditions are exactly the same conditions that limit the possibility of welfare reforms under capitalism. Let me try to explain better. This Keynesian economists after the Second World War were very preoccupied about the potential subversive effect of boosting the economy through social redistribution. The whole point here was how to maintain effective demand high without risking creating a political rupture with the founding elements of capitalism. And the founding element of capitalism are what? Wage labor and private command over investment. And this was key, is the fact that militarism, as Costas showed, is actually capable of boosting capitalist growth, of supporting private investment without risking the challenge to the very foundation of private capital investment, right? It's the state that takes a subsidiary role in supporting, incentivizing, and providing the demand for the bounties of private investors. So social redistribution and social services, paradoxically, would have had the very dangerous effect of instead potentially shaking and putting into trouble these two pillars of capital accumulation. Why? Because social redistribution was capable of breaking what is the fundamental core need for a capitalist economy to function, which is maintaining the majority of workers trapped in a situation of market dependence. So the fact that you need money in your pockets to eat, to sleep, to go to school, to finance your education, to finance your healthcare. This market dependence that was fundamental to the capitalist exploitation process that grounds the very production of arms needed to be maintained and was potentially going to be disruptive by excessive social redistribution. This is very important, I think, to understand how what we see in the making in the 1960s and this enormous amount of military expenditures, and this is supposedly the golden era in which, in fact, welfare measures are considered central to the capitalist economy. This is largely an idealization, because if you look at the data, and there's a wonderful book by Tim Barker that you can check out. It's going to come out soon, actually. I read his the book before coming out. He shows that social transfers in the United States were always by far lower than military expenditures. And this is, I think, not by chance. What we understand here are the structural limits, the structural political limits of a capitalist economy. The capitalist state in a capitalist economy cannot risk challenging private command of over investment, cannot risk putting into question the confidence of private investors that remain crucial for capital accumulation under capitalism, and in this way are limited in how they can, in fact, maintain a high amount of economic growth. And the way they do it is, of course, financing and incentivizing still today a lot of resources to these big conglomerates at the expense of social services. So this is why I think that when we think about austerity policies, we need to keep in mind that militarism and austerity are in fact one and the same logic. They express one and the same logic. Austerity is not about the state spending less in order to balance the budget. The austerity is about the state shifting resources from social resources that are constantly depleted to the usual suspect, the savers, investors, the big military conglomerates, the surveillance state, the technology and the high-tech technology that is spearheaded by very few large asset managers. So this is, I think, the key point, is to see that this austerity is about shifting resources, and the shift of resources is not an option, because in fact, there are clear limits to how much a state can give to people without risking the destruction of the very foundation of capitalism itself. I'm sorry, I needed to make a connection that I completely lost track of right now. I know I need to close, so let me try to go to the close. So this is exactly, I think, how what's happening in Europe today is very emblematic. We see here how the very rules that the Europe imposes on the deficit are being broken to enhance militarism, while they're being kept very much in force to diminish and constantly block social expenditures. And this is something that is, again, just like the excessives that we're seeing today in Palestine, expressing what are fundamental truths of our capitalist economy that even the Keynesian economists were seeing in a moment in which supposedly welfare was possible after the Second World War. It was always warfare that took priority over welfare. And this is not because of bad actors of individual corruption, but because of this fundamental political limit of what is possible under capitalism if the system depends on the fact that the majority has to be put in the condition to have no other option but to go work for a boss and have no agency in society. I want to close by saying that, of course, part of the Marxian understanding of the importance of militarism is also about how to reinforce the disciplinary mechanisms over the working people. And this is something that, of course, Rosa Luxemburg saw very well when she was theorizing about her own observations about the First World War. The fact that clearly the Second International went into pieces because of the capacity of a war to express pure ideology in the sense of saying we are all equal behind a national flag and we hate the enemy, which are other workers. And this capacity to unite ideologically and conceal the internal class warfare that is constantly being played out by the capitalist state is another very important way in which militarism not only boosts economic growth and maintains our capitalist economy running, but it also propels this fundamental increase of consensus for a capitalist state because it takes away clearly the eyes from what matters, which is, in fact, austerity at home, what the money is spent for corporations, both at home and abroad, to propel this constant capital accumulation. I'm going to stop here and we can continue in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Clara. So much to think about. We only have 10 minutes for discussion, so I wanted to go back to Costas and ask him if he would like to add or comment before I start asking questions, and I can embed my questions with the Q&A from the attendees if that's preferred.
I think this is, I don't really have much of substance to add at this stage. I'm waiting for people to come up with questions. The only thing I want to mention here is that if you look at military expenditure as proportion of GDP right now, which has increased, like I said, in the United States, it's about 3.5% of GDP. United States GDP is very big, of course. It's about 3.5% of GDP, and that's substantial. It's still below the peak periods of the Cold War, right? But it has grown. If you look at the Europeans, the expenditure is, UK, Germany, and so on. It's the German one that has increased. It hasn't reached 2% yet, but it's coming up. And it's hovering between 2 and 2.5% because Trump has pushed them towards, increasing it 5% in the future. Whether the Europeans can do it is debatable because obviously fiscal pressure, with the exception of Germany, is enormous. But even in the German case, is highly debatable. In China, which also has a very big economy, military expenditure as proportion of GDP is actually considerably small. It's less than 2%. People should bear that in mind. It's just the Chinese economy is very big, and if you spend 1.9% of GDP, you're going to get a lot of guns. The economy that has become fully militarized is Russia. 7% of GDP military expenditure, and the reason obviously is war. And war in Russia, war in Ukraine, has meant the revitalization of the Russian economy. I want to stress that. It has meant that Russia has actually stopped leaking capital because Russia was like a sieve, right? I mean, losing capital, people taking money out of Russia for decades. That stopped, partly because they cannot do it, partly because they will not be allowed to do it because of regulations by the West, right? So sanctions by the West. So Russia has stopped leaking capital, and it is now restructuring its economy partly towards military production, partly towards input substituting industrialization. So we're going to see considerable changes in the world balance of economic power in the years ahead, partly because of this. War is always, the mother and father of change. That's basically what's been happening at the moment. So no doubt, expenditure is a very important part of demand, as Clara has said, but it is in this range at the moment. It's in the 2 to 3% range for the big ones. How that's going to pan out, we shall have to wait and see, and that will depend on what popular reactions will do.
Thank you for that, Costas. Clara, did you want to jump in and say something, or should I?
Yeah,
ask a question?
I think right now the target in Europe is 5%, right?
In the future, yeah.
In the future.
Ahead.
And this is important because, again, you see how Italy, for example, will have to borrow, the Italian government will have to borrow money in order to be able to sustain this level of increased military expenditure. And what this means is that Italy will be financing mostly private investor, because we know that, again, it's private conglomerates that run the military economy, while it's increasing its debt burden. So the interest on debt will keep going up. And this will be another reason why the expenditures for schooling, housing, transport that in Italy are at emergency levels. Italy is a country I'm taking as example, but this is kind of like a widespread phenomenon. We have a social emergency, right? Poverty levels are increasing. There is the level of working poor is off the roof. So what we see here is, again, how this mechanism further channels this constant plunder of resources from those who produce value themselves, the workers, away from the social services once the state becomes in debt to support militarism. And we know that this limit on debt, interestingly enough, only holds when we talk about social expenditures, not military expenditures. So I do think that right now what we're seeing in Europe is a very interesting case of kind of real exposure of the reality of it all, right? For a long time, technocrats were using a veil of there's some kind of natural laws that we need to respect. We need to respect the deficit rule because this is just like as rigorous as somehow the gold standard was back in the day, and we can't modify it. Now what we're seeing is clearly how we are in an economy that is all based on very classist political choices, again, because the state decisions are crucial to guiding capitalism and supporting it, especially in moments of fundamental loss of profitable venues in a place like Europe that is clearly losing in the global competition. So we see here clearly how there is an ever more tendency to show clearly what this economy is all about. The state can always make exception when it's about, of course, financing and boosting private investment, but will never be able to, in fact, open the faucets when it's about social expenditures, unless, of course, there's huge mobilization from the bottom and huge pressure from the bottom, which right now we hope to see more of. But this will be the only way to force the capitalist state to in fact, invest a little bit more in the social infrastructure. Right now, we're not seeing this. And again, in moments in which more was done, this was a moment in which the social contract was risking collapse. And this is actually what happened in the 70s, right? In moments in which the pressure from below did make it such that workers were able to demand and receive higher, for example, labor share, higher wages, better benefits in the late 60s, early 70s. This was a moment of potential breakdown of the system that was reversed with a very high degree of austerity and in order to avoid this political collapse of our economic system.
Can I just make a point, Hanin, which is also
Please go ahead.
takes a cue from what Clara just said. In Europe, there's absolutely no chance at all of the European powers making 5% of GDP in arms expenditure. There's no chance at all. In the current state of European powers, that's just talk. They will increase arms expenditure, as I pointed out, but France and the UK in particular, no chance at all. Actually, they can barely make 3%. If they attempt to make 3%, the social tensions will be enormous. Already, for instance, in Britain, the Starmer government, which is sending money to Ukraine while attempting to cut it from welfare spending on the weakest and the poorest, is facing tremendous difficulties with the budget. So militarism and arms expenditure will definitely rise, as I've already indicated, but 5% is pie in the sky. That's just talk for them. Germany is the big outlier. And the reason why Germany is the big outlier is because obviously the level of public debt in Germany is much lower than that in France and in the UK. And therefore the German state can borrow and it can remilitarize society. And it's attempting to do it. Germany is now the biggest military spender in Europe. That's militarism. And it is anti-Russian nationalism, whatever ideology in Germany is now reaching a peak. And very dangerous phenomena are appearing and emerging in the German body politic because they're attempting to implement again national conscription for national service for the armed forces. I don't think there will be opposition to it, and I don't think they will greatly succeed. But that gives you a picture of where European militarism is. This is, to a large extent, derivative militarism. It follows the Americans. It is the subservient position of the European ex-chief imperialists as basically the main attack dogs of American imperialism now. But the economic problems they've got are very serious. There is no equivalent military industrial complex in Europe. and it won't be easy for Europe to create it. There are serious military outfits and military industrial producers, but there is no complex of the same type. And Europe might continue going down that path. That's what the EU seems to be advocating, but there will be significant economic difficulties and obviously very major social and political opposition to it. And long may that be so, because the last thing Europe needs is more spending on arms. As I've already indicated, even now, the combined spending of Germany, France, and the UK is about 40% greater than that of Russia, even now. So the last thing that Europe needs is another boost of arms spending.
And I think, Costas, the point here is that, of course, like Europe, in the sense, people don't need it, but clearly the economic structure that oppresses us, is that kind of like dictates where our resources go, is indeed winning from this type of choices, right? So I think, in a way, it's relevant to take in the Marxian framework exactly to say, you know, what Europe needs is an abstract concept unless we qualify, like, for what purpose. Like, what citizens clearly don't need war, they would need social services that they're not getting, while the economic system, and or better, those few who benefit from the economic system. Again, the economic system, we can't understand it as a whole, and that's the whole point, right? So within the economic system, the majority of us who operate according to the logic of need do not need militarism, but the minority that is actually benefit from the system itself is constantly, you know, hyped up and supported and maintained. And this is how the rich are getting richer, because they are the investors in these sectors that are awfully profitable. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, I would. But of course, I think that we've got to be careful when it comes to the extent to which military spending supports demand, and therefore, you know, the Luxembourg type thing, and then allows accumulation to happen to proceed. There's no question that to a certain extent it happens, but right now the issue here, and that's what I try to portray in my introduction, has to do with the structure of big business and big finance, and how it controls production networks and how it controls trade networks across the world, and therefore leads to confrontations. If you see the areas of military contestation, and if you see what generates the drive towards war, is precisely the points that I mentioned before: key minerals, choke points of trade, technology control, ability to manage how investment proceeds. And this doesn't require colonies anymore. Big business doesn't require colonies. These large outfits of capital don't require colonies anymore, but they do require control over the state. If you look at the United States, large multinationals and large financial institutions, big banks, and the large asset managers, who are now even bigger than the banks, have got enormous policy influence. They're everywhere. They are behind the aggressive posturing and the aggressive position of the United States, because that's what the contestation is about: defending the supply chains, defending the networks of finance, defending the payment systems, defending the role of the dollar, and drawing military power and drawing surpluses out of that. That's basically what we're seeing. And of course, into the bargain comes boosting domestic demand as well. $430 billion annually spent by the Pentagon. 40% of that goes to the five big ones. And the five big ones have got export interests as well, but also large numbers, hundreds of thousands of small and medium enterprises, which live off that. Anybody who comes from those depressed and troubled states of the United States that have suffered deindustrialization and so on knows exactly what I mean. Money spent by the Pentagon means jobs. Means activity. And if you're going to fight against militarism, you've got to know what you're talking about. You've got to be able to bring that into play. You've got to say, look, this isn't the way to go. That's not how you reindustrialize. That's not how you reposition the productive powers of the United States or productive powers of the United States economy in the world. That's not how to do it. That is not how to achieve a better economy, a fairer economy, and so on. It's a difficult argument.
I guess, sorry, Hanin, I know we need to go, but if I can make one more comment, I guess the issue here is that I think what I'm saying and what you're saying is not necessarily incompatible, in the sense that if we look at even how these economists who are interested in so one thing is to say, you know, these big conglomerates have captured the capitalist state and thus in a way like bring it to mostly finance their business, right? To guarantee permanent demand for their commodities and their business. But the other point is to say that even when the state supposedly is acting neutrally with respect to the capitalist economy, what the state can do, and that's like the point that I think these technocrats, these Keynesian technocrats express very well, paradoxically, is that they're the state, to boost economic growth, to maintain effective demand high, is constitutively limited in what it can do because of the issue of potentially challenging and upsetting private investors on the one hand, right? And on the other hand, also galvanizing and boosting the political awareness and force of the working classes. So if the state, instead of investing in the big military industrial complex, starts investing in public housing and social transport, in what actually can at once compete with private investment and also empower workers to say, hey, you know what? We got these gains. Can we get more? Can we continue? Can we actually have a participation instead of being completely like marginalized and agency taken out of us, which is the norm right now? Then this is potentially explosive for the system. And it's very interesting because even in the 60s, these economists knew this, to the point that the reason why they needed to stop financing, for example, a lot of citywide urban development programs was because these were enhancing the political awareness of the Black Americans, for example, right? The civil rights movement was propelled by very minor social reforms that were giving some benefits to workers and potentially like politicizing them. So I think this is important, right? It's not just about, it's both. It's of course what these conglomerates want, but it's also, as supposed neutral technocrats running a capitalist state, the capitalist state cannot afford, if we don't want to endanger if we don't want to potentially propel a collapse of the political foundation of the system, so wage labor and private property of the means of production, the capitalist state cannot boost the economy in a way that is socially responsible, because this goes against the logic of profit maximization that is the logic we're in right now. And I think this part of the conversation is important to show how militarism and austerity are kind of two sides of the same coin in a way, and they're not in opposition with one another. There's a lot of discussion on the left about how militarism is a new form of Keynesianism. Well, if we discover that Keynesianism itself presupposed the foundations for austerity, they never questioned it, right? As soon as they start blaming inflation on the workers, while they could never blame inflation on the military expenditures, for example. So this type of a clear-cut understanding of the limits of what can be done was something that is also part of Keynesianism. So to understand this as a new form of Keynesianism is kind of, I think, missing the point of understanding that austerity is not about the state stepping in more. The state is always stepping in. It's about the state making political choices that are in tune with what the system needs in order to propel it, if that makes sense.
There's plenty to say, but I think Hanin should take some questions from people, because I see there's a long list. So, you know, you can pick and choose.
Let's move to the questions. And I think as I start reading the questions, I would like to preface them with something. I don't necessarily think that you're presenting opposing views. Maybe there are also different vantage points that are being taken as those issues are being looked at. And one thing that maybe it would be interesting for us to kind of zoom in on as we answer questions is, one, the trade-offs that different countries have to make when they decide to militarize. The reason the US militarizes is very different from why Russia's militarizing, very different from why Germany's militarizing, and definitely very different from why China's militarizing. And each one of those countries could potentially benefit, as Clara is saying, I mean, as you're both saying, from militarizing, but they're also making very serious trade-offs when they choose to prioritize militarizing in this very specific moment. So there are advantages and there are trade-offs that have to be made because of this militarization. And I think it would be good if we are able to zoom in on those choices that those different countries have to make, because not all of these countries are choosing to militarize as an economic policy. Some are coerced into having to invest more into militarization, and some are not. Some are using it as a policy, or it is actually, in fact, a choice. Okay, so one of the questions that came in say, what would be the implications? What would the implications be for states such as the UK and Canada if they were to leave NATO? Unlikely, I know, but entertain the idea.
Who is that for?
Costas, I think. Not unspecified, but
I don't think there's any chance at all of this happening, other than through working class pressure from below. I don't think that the ruling bloc of either Canada or certainly the UK, but actually both, even despite the tension between Canada and the United States right now, but I don't think that the ruling blocs of these countries would ever choose to do that. I mean, unless something very extraordinary happened. I think this would happen only if profound social change had taken place in those countries, if the working class and the lower subaltern classes, to use Gramsci's term, had actually risen and challenged the status quo, then it might happen. If that happened, then there would be greater chances for peace across the world and less chance of disappearing in a nuclear holocaust at some point, because the biggest threat to humanity at the moment is NATO. NATO is the most aggressive form of military alliance the world has ever known. It's spread across the world. It has enormous military resources. He has brought more and more countries into it. What is Sweden doing in NATO, for God's sake? Why did Finland join NATO? Countries which have survived for decades very successfully being neutral. Why did the Swedish ruling bloc decide that this country had to join NATO, for God's sake? What benefit is that to Sweden? It's very difficult to put your finger on. I can see the threats to it, because obviously by joining NATO, Russia will now have to put 150,000 men along the Finnish border. Obviously, that's what's going to happen if that's the situation. So if these countries left NATO and began to shape a foreign policy along the lines of workers' interests, in other words, if they formulated a foreign policy based on working class interests, if they began to speak the language of the working class, in other words, rather than the language of the ruling elite, which is basically what internationalism is all about, speaking the language of the working class, then we would get, that would be a serious move towards peace, towards abating the massive tensions that we see across the world. But right now, I don't think there's any prospect of that. I'd like to work towards it, and in fact, I would like to advocate it. And I think that any serious left organization should do so in both Canada and the United States and the United Kingdom. But realistically, we've got to know where we are.
Thank you, Costas. Is there anything that you wanted to add, Clara?
No, good.
So I'm combining two questions. One is asking about the increase in military expenditure in the US and how that affects Latin America and what their position is vis-a-vis this increase in spending. Also, the collapse of the international legal order and how would that impact the US's plan to continue to militarize and increase the expenditure on militarism, but also how it behaves in the international arena, especially that it hasn't been necessarily tamed in the past. And now with the collapse of the international order, how would that impact its position moving?
Sorry, Hanin, can you repeat this last question for me? Sorry.
So the last question is basically saying, with the collapse of the international order and the US continuing to invest in militarism, how is this going to impact how it will continue to behave internationally?
You want me to have a crack at it and then you come back, Clara, after that? Or you want to go?
I'll pope these. No, go ahead. I'll come back to it. Go ahead.
What is the international order? The international order is basically a system of regulations, treaties, arrangements and agreements, which the United States has established in the post-war years, partly unilaterally, mostly through the multilateral organizations. It's basically a complex array of practices, regulations, agreements, and institutions that have basically consolidated US hegemony in the Western world for several decades and then spread to the rest of the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's basically the infrastructure and the foundations of US imperialism and US hegemony for 70 years. The United States makes that and changes it as it sees fit. We moved into, it's no longer the law-based order, it's the rules-based order. And that's a very, very important point. There's no law, there's rules. Who makes the rules? The United States. So it's basically an admission of how the thing works. Now, if this is retreated, it's retreated because the United States has discovered that now challenges have emerged, who can fire back. That's really the difference. You see, when the war in Iraq took place, and the United States absolutely dominated it because the imbalance of power was gigantic, and it could smash the Iraqi army and then kill hundreds of thousands of people afterwards without any cost significant to itself. It was easy to believe that American superpowerdom was unchallenged, it will remain unchallenged forever. That's not the case. What has emerged in the last decade is that that's no longer the case. Yeah, the United States is the most powerful country in the world, no question, but the others can fire back. And if the others can fire back, that's a cost. And if there's a cost, then the calculations on the part of the American imperial elite becomes very different. And that has meant reorganizing the so-called rules-based order and making it up as they go along, because they don't really have any clear direction. Ultimately, however, and that's the last point I'm going to make, what drives this constantly changing rules-based order, whatever that is the interests of the big multinationals and the big financial institutions, which are driving this imperialism and the push towards armaments. That's basically what drives it. That's basically what characterizes it. It's the ability to control the choke points, the ability to control the key minerals, the ability to control the key means of payment, the ability to control all these instruments which depend on rules that allow the United States to be the top dog, the main imperial power, and allows the US capitalist class to be the dominant capitalist class, such as it is. That is no longer viable in the way in which it was. That's where we are. That's really what's happening. That's really the imperial contestation. It's the rise of other powers, and that's going to be what we've got ahead of us. Unless something happens domestically, unless something happens where we live, that's not going to change. It ain't going to change up there. There is no agreement. Let me put it differently to you. When the United States was confronting the Soviet Union, the opposition was political and ideological. It wasn't economic. So it was possible for the US superpower and the Soviet superpower to come to some sort of amicable agreement that would produce rules and laws through which they could coexist. The competition today is also economic. It is to do with multinationals. It is to do with big business. There is no foundation for a stable arrangement there. None. We cannot reproduce the framework that provided political and military sort of kind of balance in the Cold War. It doesn't exist. We are in an era of intensifying imperialist competition. The end result is war. You should have no illusions at all about it. Unless something happens domestically, unless we change the balance of power, unless we negate imperial power, chiefly in the United States, because that's where it's coming from.
Thank you, Costas. I think there's a question for you, Clara, that will also tie to what Costas is saying. So feel free to answer the question and comment on Costas' response. And it says, do you think that Harvey's accumulation by disposition based on Luxembourg can be reconciled with your approach to warfare over welfare?
Yes, I think so. And I wanted to, so let me see how I want to respond both to Costas and yeah, I mean, that is the whole point, I think, is to focus on the difference between the logic of need and the logic of profit, and just figure out how the logic of need is constantly quashed by the logic of profit that dominates, and that the logic of profit requires certain social relations to be maintained. And I think this is the point that I think complements, I hope, the Costa story, is that we shouldn't take for granted the social relations that are the grounding ones of economic growth per se, right? What is growth? What is this accumulation of wealth? Is based on the unpaid labor time of workers in the West, and of course, even much more in the global South. So this is the social relation that is foundational to capitalism, is in fact a political relation. And this is a little bit of what I've been trying to badly say today. Sorry, I wasn't in my full form, but is exactly this, is that if we take into account what I think is the number one intuition of why Marx's critique of political economy is interesting for us today, to say that capital is manifested in wealth and GDP growth and money, but it rests on specific social order. This social order is not a spontaneous one. And I think this is really the point, is that it constantly needs to be maintained into place. And if we understand that this is a social order that presupposes the subordination of the majority of us in this world are not benefiting from capitalism, right? And this is, I think, part of how, with the fall of the international law today, is interesting, is that people are realizing it very, very ferociously on their own skin. We have 1 worker out of 8 in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, that lives off of food benefits, and that is not going to get food benefits, food stamps, the austerity and militarism. So we are talking of half of the American workers are working poor. They can't meet their basic needs. 70% of American families are financially insecure. The numbers are not so different in Europe. In Italy, we also have 1 kid out of 7 who is in absolute poverty. We have half of the workers who are working poor, and these are statistics that kind of like are widespread by now in the capitalist West. And of course, we know that that we are talking about a situation in which the great majority is in poverty, right? And so in the globe. So this is a system that clearly is not working for people, but it needs to be maintained by subordinating these very people, because they are the ones who are producing this value that allows the very few to, in fact, accumulate and continue enriching themselves. So I think this is the whole point, is that we should not take for granted this fundamental social order. And thus we need to understand that the capitalist state, well before neoliberalism and all the way to its very beginning with primitive accumulation, is all about dispossession and maintaining dispossession live and well. You cannot do without constant dispossession because of the risk of otherwise opening up spaces for potential political contestation, which the system cannot afford, if that makes sense. So I think the whole point about seeing today how there is this complete breakdown of international law is also interesting in terms of what should citizens in Europe and the United States like do with this, because clearly Costas is right. We are back at basically a Hobbesian state of war in which the whole ideology of the West being the world of the free, the whole ideology that was constructed after the Second World War with in full force, again, with the idea that, you know, that the world of freedom was better than the world of unfreedom of the Soviet bloc, has completely collapsed. This ideology does not hold any longer. And it's clear if we look at what is happening with the ICJ. The ICJ is useless. You can, you know, the ICJs use all these supposed like pillars of the Western progress and liberal democracy are clearly showing how they're just a farce. And they've always been a farce, but now it's a historical moment in which I think more than ever, this is being recognized. Even the idea of free speech. Clearly, free speech in the radical sense is not allowed in this country. And we're seeing it with the suppression of any possibility of contesting investors that are financing the genocide at the universities. So I think this is important, is that apart from what power will dominate the global order, it's also interesting to see what does this collapse of international law mean in terms of people opening up their eyes. Because if you add this collapse of international law and this clear neocolonial will to dominate, I mean, the whole Gaza reconstruction plan is unbelievable how obviously explicit it is, that it's all about, it has been from the beginning, all about plundering land resources and making huge business off of what was until recently an open air prison, right? So I think the visibility of it all today is incredibly reminiscent of Rosa Luxemburg's idea that it's either socialism or barbarism. This is, in fact, what barbarism to me looks like, both in terms of knowing that there's people that can't afford a house in Tulsa where I live, knowing what's happening in the rest of the globe. This is barbarism. And I think the point is that the key question, is this going to help propel a greater thirst for critical understandings of the crucial connection between capitalism and militarism? Militarism is not just an added element to our economy. It's foundational to it, which I think is kind of what is the key element of this class today, is how you wouldn't have capitalism without militarism. You wouldn't have militarism as we know it today without capitalism. Are we in a historic moment in which these realizations will help spur a true movement for peace, which means ultimately a desire for a post-capitalist economy within these capitalist countries? I think this is the interesting question of the moment. How far is this going to go? Or are we just going to all, you know, accept our faith of all being Palestinians, because clearly what is happening there can very clearly happen everywhere else at this point? And is there going to be any reaction to this? I think this is the real political issue. Where is the mobilization behind this? That's, I think, what we should be focusing on today.
Thank you, Clara. I can move to a different question, even though it might feel abrupt, because this takes us to Russia. There are two questions. One is asking about sanctions and how they generally impact the global South negatively. But in the case of Russia, it's been the opposite. It's been bolstered. And another question also about Russia is to compare how does the modern Russia war economy compare to the capitalist war economies of the 20th century? And this is a question that I can think for Costas.
Okay. Let's think about it carefully. As I mentioned already, Russia is the third superpower. People better get used to it. It's not the third superpower economically, certainly so militarily. And its economy is a lot bigger than people usually allow for. When the war in Ukraine began, there was a lot of very, very shallow talk about how weak Russia is. Basically, whatever, petrol station with nuclear missiles, that kind of nonsense, which came from the arrogance of of those who had thought that it won the Cold War. Now, Russia is capitalistic, thoroughly so. There's nothing socialist about it. A lot of people get very confused about it. They think that if you talk about Russia in any kind of measured way, that somehow you're defending socialism. There's nothing socialist about it. I think Vladimir Putin is as business-minded and as capitalistic as he can possibly be. And he's also a very rich man. Right? He's a very rich man, and he hasn't become rich through hard work. Let me tell you that. So Russia is not, it's got nothing to do with socialism or anything like that. It's a capitalist state. And it is a capitalist state which actually contains a lot of large, big businesses, multinationals, controlling several key commodities. And they had tentacles across the world until sanctions were imposed on them. So it looks as if it's far more constrained now than it was before, because it was forced to do so through political intervention by the West. The basic structure of capitalism in Russia is not that different in terms of what makes it tick. Big business, big finance, essentially. What has happened through war, which is what always happens after major war, is that they were forced to reorganize their domestic economy. Otherwise, they would have been defeated. Because the strategy of the West was, we arm Ukraine. Ukraine creates a powerful army, which is essentially a NATO army, has a powerful army, and it gets the better of the Russians in the field. And we apply sanctions on Russia, and we destroy the economy, and therefore we defeat Russia. That was basically the strategy. This strategy is failing, and that's important to understand in terms of the imperialist contestation. But for the economy specifically, the imposition of sanctions had an unexpected result, because for a start, I already mentioned it, it stopped the leakage of capital. Russia was like a sieve. It was run by an elite, a bourgeois sort of layer, which had come out of the Communist Party, which basically believed in nothing, glorified the West, and actually believed in money. And it kept sending money extracted out of the labor of the Russian people abroad. Enormous amounts of money. That became impossible. So the money stopped and started being invested domestically. Which meant creating an arms economy, otherwise the war would be lost, and import substituting economy. Now, the Russian state inherited a vast industrial structure from the Soviet Union. Those who tell you that the Soviet Union produced nothing are ideologues. All you've got to do is look at the bridges in Ukraine, created by the Soviet state. You bomb them, they don't fall. Why? Because they were built to last. So some things done by the Soviet state were actually solidly done. I've got no beef for the Soviet state. I just recognize reality. So the Soviet Union inherited a lot of industrial capacity from the Soviet state, and then it proceeded to destroy much of it. Russia did. Proceeded to destroy much of it. And it destroyed, above all, tool-making capacity. That's the biggest weakness of Russian industry, tool-making capacity. They had a massive tool-making sector, which they destroyed because the bandits took over. What's been happening the last 2-3 years is, through force of circumstance, they're recreating industry, partly connected to arms expenditure and militarism. And they have re-emerged as a major producer of steel, major producer of aluminum, major producer of a whole series of other industrial goods. Go and check material production of goods. Don't check GDP figures. Check what Russia produces in terms of steel, right? And in terms of these goods, you will see that's not far off, and it's actually bigger than the United States in key weights. That's the reality of the Russian economy right now. That's the reality of Russian capitalism right now. So sanctions had a negative and unprecedented and unexpected effect because of that. But they had another effect too. And that you need to go back to Keynes to understand. When Keynes analyzed how Britain was to fight the Second World War in his famous publication, How to Fight the War, he made a series of observations which applied to Russia glove in hand, or hand in glove, they fully. He basically said, and that applies to Russia, if we're to produce more guns, which Russia has to fight the war, we have to shift resources away from peace production while also maintaining peace production. But if we do that, we will create full employment. If we create full employment, then clearly wages will tend to go up because workers will demand higher wages and markets will push wages up. But if wages go up and peace production cannot increase because capacity has gone to war production, then prices will go up. And if prices go up, that will eat into real wages. And actually, despite a rise in nominal wages, it will mean that people can consume less because prices have gone up. That's exactly what's happening in Russia at the moment. The shift towards military production, taking capacity away from, to a certain extent, away from peace production, although peace production is also being bolstered, but much capacity has gone to military production. It has boosted real wages up. There's full employment in Russia. Nominal wages are increasing left, right, and center because of that. But inflation is also rocketed. That's the reason. Supply cannot keep up. Peace supply cannot keep up. And Russian people know it. Russian people feel the pinch as this happens. And that's the problem of Putin right now. That's the problem he's facing. The problem he's facing is that if he continues down this path, then there's difficulty for working class Russians and ordinary people in Russia maintaining the standard of living. That's his biggest problem. And to a certain extent, the US ruling elite and the European ruling elite understand it. That's why they've got no interest in peace. They are always advocating war and escalating the contest. They are the real warmongers right now. How that will be resolved is not clear at the moment. It's not clear at all, but it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. And that is exactly what we've been discussing here. The dangers to world peace emanating from this constant drive towards militarism, arms expenditure, contestation, and the mobilization of the state in order to serve the interests of big business. That will not go away unless we build a movement that challenges the rule of capital domestically. That's the only way to do it. And that's the lesson from classical Marxism.
Yeah, I guess one question of interest would be whether there's any plan to apply wage and price controls, right? Because this is how has been done in other war economies, and wage and price controls were even implemented in the United States in the 70s with Nixon, actually, right, in 1971, because of this. Because inflation, of course, escalates in a war economy, but inflation is the deadliest fear of a capitalist economy more broadly, right? That's actually the biggest problem economists have to grapple with in advanced capitalist economies is inflation, and the fact that inflation cripples, again, the political consent for the system, not just the economic balances and not just the value of the currency and thus the possibility of actually having a stable store of value, but also the political consequences. Is inflation a moment in which indeed workers are inspired to mobilize more, to ask for more? And is this for many, including Keynes, inflation could be in fact the trigger to the death of capitalism as such? And I think this is actually really interesting to see how, paradoxically, in the wartime, even the capitalist economies would accept wage price control, which is something that they were trying to avoid in peacetime, with, of course, and that's why the best way to avoid inflation in peacetime is to just do a lot of austerity, because in that way you just repress wages through increasing unemployment, which is exactly what higher interest rates do in many countries in the West right now. This is how we got out of the COVID inflationary spiral, supposedly. Now, there's a lot of talk about whether, in fact, tight labor markets were the reason for inflation in the first place, because a lot of people say that there's other explanations, especially with the having to do with the very high profit margins. But definitely the way to get out of the inflationary threat after the post-COVID was higher interest rates that have a very negative effect on the labor market. And this, again, saved the system from the inflationary spiral that could have mobilized people in a direction that was potentially post-capitalist. So I think it's really interesting to see how inflation is a particular problem in a war economy, but it is a cardinal feature of a capitalist economy that has been always the biggest problem for macroeconomists in figuring out. And if I can say last thing, it's also interesting how the narrative about inflation that dominates is always one that points the finger, of course, to the misbehavior of workers in demanding higher wages because of supposedly their higher bargaining power in that moment. So also the narrative about inflation is a narrative that is functional to trying to square the suffering in the direction of workers, while this narrative is in itself already a way to protect the system from the potential collapse of inflation manifesting and getting people pissed off. The best way to do it is to tell people, well, actually, it's your fault that inflation is happening, so that justifies rather than, because price controls are in a way hinting to a post-capitalist direction, right? They do hint, price controls somehow do hint towards more planned economies, more political power over just the economic motive. They do question the private command over investment, and this is already potentially dangerous for what it can open up in terms of possibilities. And that's why it's always a good rule to tell workers that if inflation is happening, it's their fault, so that you avoid that. And I just wonder whether in Russia they're also using that narrative, and whether they're contemplating price controls and wage controls. I don't know, but that's how historically this has been resolved.
I am not entirely. This is all. That's it. I mean, that in terms of the ideology of it, I'm not entirely certain, because I don't follow the Russian debates that closely. I'm not sure how that is being presented in terms of the ideology of how we battle inflation. How that's presented in Russia. What I do know is, in terms of economic policy, standard methods were applied. In other words, increasing interest rates, and that's what the Central Bank of Russia did, and that's why the economy didn't grow particularly this year, because they squeezed. And they squeezed in exactly the same way that Western governments also squeezed. This isn't a different economy for them. This is capitalism. I say this for people who've got some illusions about what's happening in Russia. It's state-managed capitalism, but not that state-managed. Because if it really was state-managed, then they would have gone down the path that you just outlined. They would have gone down the path of actually protecting the income of working people, or allowing working people to acquire a claim on future production. Because you see, how is Russia financing the increase in military production if the resources are constrained? If it's not bringing in workers from abroad, it's not bringing in workers from abroad. It's actually the Russian population, the labor of the Russian population, that's doing it. How is Russia financing it? The rise in inflation means that effectively real income is declining, and the loss of real income by Russian workers is actually the resources that go into military production. That's basically what's happening, right? In macro terms. If there was a different management of the economy, which there isn't, then what would have happened is that these workers who are losing income now because of the war and so on would have acquired claims on future income generated some other how. But that's not what's happening. There's been no special fund to allow them to do that. There's been no special method to allow, and there's been no price controls either, which would actually forcibly lower that and allow workers to maintain their standard of living. What there is interest rates increases. So this is capitalism, red in tooth and claw in Russia. You should have no illusions. And it is competing against US capitalism as it can. That's basically what's happening. It's contestation for hegemony between two competing capitalists. Not the same, not identical, far from it. But then capitalism is never identical wherever you look among countries. And the issue then must be analyzed along the lines that classical Marxists have taught us, but adjusted for the present time. No colonies per se. No control per se, no control, administrative control. This complex way in which capital, big business, big finance dominates the world, extracts surplus from its own workers and from people abroad. This exploitative, appalling system that's leading to world war. That's where we're heading, unless something happens about that.
Yeah.
This takes us actually to the following kind of category of questions. There are multiple questions that are alluding at where are we headed? And the first one focuses on Europe. And it says, how come European powers are not coordinating their military spending, but just care about domestic means? How does this play into the perspective of national and supranational EU NATO capital? And another one is saying military power projection among the center are very imbalanced, which would trigger further militarization of the states. Could the speakers speak to this and the rise of the hybrid warfare?
The
I didn't
rise of
really
what?
The
Sorry, I didn't
hybrid
catch. Ah,
I didn't really
hybrid
understand
warfare.
I didn't understand the second part of the question. You said what's in balance? Can you repeat that part? Sorry.
Military power projection among the center are very imbalanced, which would trigger further militarization of states. Could both speakers speak in could both speakers speak to overinvestment in digital economy and the rise of hybrid warfare, but also as part of the race to AI dominance?
there are several things here. I don't know exactly what the question is. All I would say is that from my perspective, the rise of AI and the enormous AI bubble that we're witnessing at the moment, with huge amounts of money being invested in these data centers in the United States and elsewhere, exacerbates this, exacerbates precisely the competition that I mentioned, brings other smaller capitalist formations into play. They all want a share of it. There is a contestation about who will control what. It's unclear how it's going to pan out. The main contestants are China, obviously China and the United States. It brings into the bargain questions of clearing, financial clearing, world money, and so on. It brings into it dimensions of how these new methods will enter the production process if they do, and how they will affect circulation costs if and when they do. And it exacerbates all these tensions. It's not a path for peace. These are the big tech are an exemplar of this incredibly aggressive type of capital that I've been talking about. They are an exemplar of it. That's the kind of multinational that is the most aggressive form of capital humanity has ever known. Together with big finance, the combination is deadly. I mean, it's never been known before. It encircles the globe, and wants to suck the living daylights out of everything. And it will continue to do so, and it mobilizes the state in order to do so. I mean, defending these new capacities of creating AI across the world, dominating electricity production, dominating water supplies, dominating the availability of skilled labor in so many parts of the world, and stopping others from doing it is the future. That's what's going to be happening. There is no peace through that. There is no technological nirvana that will happen. There is capitalist competition and the threat of war. That's what's happening.
Agreed.
Okay.
And it seems to me that historically those people who are now embodying, you know, the state, the capitalist state, who are elected as representatives of the executive or in charge of these more technocratic institutions like central banks, they don't seem to be at all capable of any vision, right? So it's not that they really express how deep down capital has no vision. And it's interesting because I think that, again, in the Keynesian period that I'm studying, so the golden age, there was at least a sense that our economy was progressing in a direction that was going to be better for everyone. And this was the big ideology that was backing all of the success of, you know, the capitalist free West with respect to the communist bloc, was exactly the idea that through capitalist growth was the key to be able to supersede class conflict, right? And this is everything they talk about, is the fact that if labor becomes more productive, which in Marx analysis means that you're extracting more surplus from workers, note, but if labor becomes more productive, you will be able to maintain private investors' confidence high enough to continue investing. And if investor confidence, thwartles, you can have, again, the state stepping into boosting supposed effective demand. Now, again, how can one do that is a matter of political constraints. As I was saying before, it didn't ever really happen in terms of social redistribution. Even then, it usually happened either through tax breaks for the corporations. Okay, so tax cuts was like a big thing, or military spending. That's actually the way in which this economic growth was maintained in those years. But what I'm trying to say is that there was, if you read these economists that were at the Council of Economic Advisor at the time, a sense of a long-term vision about, again, always based on the need to increase capital formation and capital investment, but with the idea that this would solve class antagonism and would boost through higher employment also the most marginalized. And note, in the 60s, still 20% of the American general public was in dire poverty, right? So, but in their vision, this was gonna be superseded by the miracle of economic growth. Now we're in a situation in which I think this sense that this model has a future, I don't think even those who are the ruling elite who are standing in government believe it anymore, in my view. There's a sense in which there's just very short-term accumulation of in a very violent way. And again, I think Gaza really represents this. It's not about just wanting to focus on Palestine. We know that there's Sudan, there's many places in the world in which our people are suffering. But what is happening in Gaza is so exemplary of the fact that 2 million people, majority of which are children, are just there basically as mice of experiment of what this violent capitalist accumulation means. And it means just the death for what? For a very, very, very profitable short-term solution in terms of extracting and taking from the misery of others. So I think this is really the very big difference I find, is that the ruling elite has no story to tell us because there's no vision. There is no narrative that is holding on their end, because this narrative is clearly has no foundation. It didn't have foundation even in the 60s, because it was all a lot of ideology still based on economic suffering of the people. But there was more space to believe in it. I think right now what we're seeing is that, especially if you look, for example, at the Italian situation right now, it's clear that the people in government are just structurally corrupted by these multinational, by this asset manager, by the very, very big powers that lead all of this accumulation. But they have no plan for their own people. They're literally letting Italians not stop reproducing because of the dire poverty they're in. So I think this is something that is novel, and I wonder how it's going to pan out. But definitely the point of saying the vision of the capitalist West is over. And that's why I think China is so scary, because exactly it is still world. And then we can discuss how capitalist it is. And that, I think this is going to be a conversation of one of our next lectures. It is a world in which there is a sense that there is a vision. There are people within the state that have some form of understanding of a long-term future. I don't think the long-term future is at all in the minds or in the actions of those who are leading our government institutions, and of course those who are leading the big profitable corporations.
Thank you, Clara. I'm just going to pose one last question, and I think it's a good question for closing. It's directed to Costas, but please, both of you, feel free. It's a question about how the US has been hegemonic and how its dollar has been the world money, and how do we look at BRICS and the emergence of those alternative systems, and are they serious? What kind of threat do they pose, and how do we understand them as we move forward?
This is a very difficult question, of course, and it's difficult analytically, it's difficult politically. Analytically, because we've got to work out what actually is happening, and I'll come to that in a minute. But it's also difficult politically, and I'll start from that. It's very easy to say, oh, there was one sheriff in town, now there is another, and that gives him more opportunity to do things, which it does. You can play one against the other, and you can find more room for policy making if you are a small country compared to the time when 20 years ago, when the United States completely ruled the roost when it came to policy. But you've got to be very careful what you're wishing for, because a multipolar world, which allows for more scope for policy for smaller countries, is a world of, it's not a world of peace. That's the point I was making. It's not a world of peace at all. It's actually a world of many competing interests and many competing powers for hegemony. And people forget that the First World War was the outcome of a multipolar capitalist world. And multipolarity can end up in a complete disaster when it comes to peace and the destruction of the world. So we've got to be very careful as people who speak for the left and for the wish to speak for the working class in terms of what we want. The point isn't to advocate the rights and interests of a contestant to the United States. The point is to advocate a way in which the popular strata, the working class, can speak with their own voice, an independent voice. That's what I think we're for. A voice of the left, a voice of workers, a voice of the poor and the oppressed, which is not the voice necessarily of the contestants of the United States, not necessarily the voice of the BRICS. Those who've come close to Indian capitalists know exactly what I mean. There is nothing positive about Indian capitalists, let me assure you. Just as there's nothing positive about Arab capitalists or about any other capitalists that come from the BRICS, right? So be very careful how you pose the issue in terms of what the left or what the movement of people should be supporting. So that's the first point I want to make. Analytically, though, the issue is very, very interesting and very complex because it indicates the type of capitalist world we're moving towards. The day of complete dominance of the world economy by the United States is long in the past. What has emerged is independent centers of capitalist accumulation, none bigger than China, the main manufacturing center of the world. The United States is not really in the game anymore when it comes to that. It's allowed capacity, productive capacity in manufacturing, the very foundation of productive capitalism, to migrate. And it's not coming back easily. It will need policy, and not the nonsense of Biden or the silly things that Trump is doing. It will take serious policy for it to come back, and militarism will not allow it to come back. Militarism is not really the industrial policy that will allow that to happen. So ahead, precisely because the ruling class doesn't have any kind of vision along the lines that Clara mentioned before, we've got a continuing rise of contestants who wish to make the rules of the game according to their own interests. That's what's happening. The BRICS are attempting to shape the rules of the game in the world market as it suits them. It is their right. And they're contesting the United States. What is crucial here, and I'm coming to an end of what I want to say, what is crucial here is that all the BRICS come from what used to be considered the periphery. That's astonishing. You would have expected, following classical Marxism, the contestants to the United States to come from the old imperial powers, right? To come from the established capitalist powers, European powers, Japan, and so on, the old imperialists. That's not the case. The United States has defeated the old imperialists for now. He has dominated them. All the contestants come from the old periphery, and they represent independent centers of capitalist accumulation because the power of China, I don't want to go into the Chinese thing, whether it's socialist or capitalist, but the power of it comes from the capitalistic organization of its economy. I don't think there's any doubt at all about it, right? And the way China operates globally is through big businesses that actually are imbued with a capitalist spirit. So that is what the world looks like. Contestants arising from the old periphery, independent centers of capitalist accumulation that are elbowing their way in. They want a say. They want a say in how the game is played, in how the rules of the game are established, in how the rules of investing are established, and how the rules of trading and the rules of money are established. That's the issue. That's ultimately what drives imperialism. and contestation, and it is for us to put on the table alternative proposals that speak for a different economy, an economy driven by need and driven by the interests of working people, and an economy that speaks the language of working people. It speaks the language, in other words, the nation speaks like the poor. It speaks like the working people. That's basically what we need to bring to bear. That used to be ABC for Marxists, but it's been forgotten over the years. That's really what's at issue. And that's how I see it. And anti-imperialism is an integral part of it, because the brunt of imperial contestation is felt by the people still in the periphery. Right? That's the most aggressive form. Has always been the most exploitative, the most dominating, the most oppressing form of imperialism is felt there, and people in the global south know it, and they are a natural ally for those who wish to fight against capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we are at the time. Clara,
Yeah.
do you want to say something?
Just that I do think I'm going to Brazil actually next week. I do think there's so many social movements on the ground located in these BRICS countries that we need to take seriously, because again, also within these countries, there is this clear, very strong antagonism between the interest of foreign investors and private investors and what people need. But there's also a lot of vitality in terms of building solidarity economies, going back to the commons, getting people involved in assemblies. So I think part of what I hope the unions also in the UK do is kind of reach out and learn from these experiences of like grassroots solidarity. What we're trying to do here in Tulsa with the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation is a little bit in that vein. It's really hard because people do not know how to organize, have a hard time sitting in a room together and making decisions collectively. The system has depoliticized us deeply, but I think this is really the only route is to say, well, we want to take back those basic resources that now the economic system is taking away from us. So yes, so I would urge to try to hear out voices from movements in these countries as well, because they can be tremendously inspiring for what also is a very decadent moment in Europe and in the United States.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you for that. Thank you, Clara, so much. Thank you, Costas. This has been such a great discussion, and I hope we have more of them. Thank you both. Thank you to everyone that attended, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all.
Thank you. Thank you.